This morning, I want to challenge us to start asking two questions every time that we enter into this sacred space to worship God. I know that all of you ask at least one question, and that question is, Lord, what do you have for me here this morning? Lord, what are you going to say to me? And when we come in asking that question, that is our Western individualistic dialogue talking. And I always want to remind us, the context of what's happening here this morning is that this is God's word for God's people. And God does speak to us individually, absolutely, but it's such a default for us to only ask that question. So I would like to add another question to our repertoire when we enter into the sacred space every Sunday. And that second question is, Lord, what do you have for us? We are your people, Lord. What are you going to say to us as your people? And when we're in Exodus, we need to remember that all that God is doing in the lives of the individuals within this book is for the benefit and the advancement of the people of God. And so when we are gathered here as a people, I want to remind us that this is a sermon that is for God's people, not a self-help seminar. This is a moment when we are in worship where we don't look around at the people around us and we see them singing and raising their hands and going, well, that's really good for them, but that's not really my thing. No, the Bible says that God inhabits the praises of his people. Do you understand that when we come together to worship God every Sunday, that we are bringing a fragrant offering unto the Lord that rises from this room, and will you choose whether or not you're going to be a part of that aroma that pleases God by our worship? Because this isn't about you. It's about us. And in Exodus chapter 2, what we are going to see is the subtle sovereignty of God in the life of his people. We're going to see the subtle sovereignty of God in the life of his people. Now, what's interesting about the book of Exodus is that it's full of ooh and ah moments, right? We have the splitting of the Red Sea. We have God doing these amazing wonders in the heavens. We got rivers turning to blood. It's moments where we can look around at what's happening in this book and be like, God is clearly doing stuff, right? Now, I think that sometimes when we sort of rely on all those big moments and big things to happen, that I think we may find ourselves to be disappointed because, as many of us could possibly attest to, that sometimes it's very rare for God to do the big Red Sea splitting thing. But what we need to do is learn as God's people as how to look and see the subtle moments of God at work in the life of his people. God will be clearly present in the book of Exodus, yes, but chapter 2 of this book gives us a perspective of the subtle ways that he can work as well. Maybe not in the big moments that people look for, but in his everyday faithfulness. And that's what we'll see here in chapter 2 of Exodus. And we're going to start by looking at Exodus chapter 2, starting at verses 1 through 3. It says, now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife as a Levite woman. And the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. Now, we are picking up from chapter 1, where Pharaoh declares an edict that all of the Hebrew boys that are born are to be killed by throwing them into the Nile. And so you can understand why Moses' mother hides the child. Now, we actually don't have the names for Moses' parents here, but luckily for us, in Numbers chapter 26, verse 59, it tells us that his father's name is Amram, and his mother's name is Jochebed, Jochebed. You can write that down in your journal side there. But can you imagine the stress that this reality had upon Moses' mother? To know that you're pregnant and to be terrified at the prospect of carrying this child, only to have him to be thrown into the Nile. So Jochebed's initial actions make sense, but she soon realizes she's not going to be able to hide this boy much longer. And she's very strategic of where she places her son. It says that it is among the reeds by the riverbank. Now, I don't know why, but for some reason in my mind, I sort of always pictured that she placed Moses in the basket and kind of tossed the basket into the river and just saw what might actually happen, right? That's something that Moses' father probably would have done, just to say like, well, I'm sure it'll work out somehow, right, But not Moses' mother. She thinks through this. She is deliberate with how she builds this basket. She has an intention with where she places him. Actually, commentators said, had she tossed him in the Nile like his father might have, that there was alligators and crocodiles that probably would have got to him. So she probably knows that, so she places him among the reeds. Verses 4 through 6. And his sisters stood at a distance to know what would have been done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. She opened it and saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Now here is where we begin to see the subtle sovereignty of God at work. As Miriam, Moses' sister, stands back to see what would happen, lo and behold, of all the people that would come down to the river to bathe, is Pharaoh's daughter. Now, I think that we are a little skewed with how we might perceive this situation because we know what happens to Moses. But can you imagine? You're Miriam and Jochebed, and you're trying to preserve the life of Moses. You're under this oppressed authority of the Pharaoh. And you know that you can't hide this boy any longer, and so in your desperation and hopes to preserve his life, you try to put him in a place that maybe a compassionate Egyptian would stumble upon him and see him and care for him. And the person who finds him is the daughter of the guy who wants to throw all the babies in the Nile. Because we know that Pharaoh is clearly not a man to be messed with. He's very clear about what he wants. And surely if the people of Egypt know about the iron rule of Pharaoh, how much more the members of his household. And at a time of high honor and respect, even the members of his household would know that to cross Pharaoh would invite death. And yet, in the subtle mercy of God, not only is Pharaoh's daughter the first to see the basket, but God created in her, despite her environment of cruelty, a heart of compassion. Look at the text. It says, she took pity on him. If you have a pen, underline that. She took pity on him. And that Hebrew word here means more than just pity, because pity usually just means feel bad but do nothing about it. But this word means more action-oriented compassion. This word means more action-oriented compassion. The sorrow in her heart for this Hebrew child drives her to care for him, not destroy him. Now, commentators say that it might have actually been different had one of the maidens found the basket first, because they might have made a big stink of the whole thing. Because I don't know if you know this, but sometimes the kind of person you get given a situation sort of can be a crapshoot, right? So if we find that it should be a higher percentage in our day and age to do the right thing, but we find it's not always true, how much lower the percentage of someone to have compassion in a time of cruelty, oppression, and brutality, especially when fear of defying the king of Egypt looms large. But not the daughter of Pharaoh, who, believe it or not, actually defies her father here, even more importantly, the king. How come? Because God formed into her a heart of compassion, and God used that heart to preserve the life of Moses. Think about it. God, in his sovereignty, wields the emotions and the personality of Pharaoh's daughter towards the purposes of his people. It could have been anybody else. Someone who clung to deep loyalty to Pharaoh. Someone who wanted to brag to all the other Egyptians about how they found this Hebrew boy and just tossed him into the Nile. But the subtle sovereignty of our God guided Moses to be found by the right person at the right time. Verses 7 through 9. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. So we have Miriam waiting in the wings to observe what would happen to her brother here, and she takes full advantage of this moment. She must have seen the compassion that was happening within the Pharaoh's daughter, and that she probably knows that Pharaoh's daughter can't nurse him, so she is wise to offer some solutions about what can actually help this child. Now, it's unclear to us whether or not Miriam sort of pretended to be an Egyptian woman, or she didn't really care all that much about being a Hebrew woman approaching the Egyptian princess. But nonetheless, in God's subtle sovereignty, she agrees for a Hebrew woman to nurse a child, and it happens to be who? Moses' mother. I mean, look at the situation here, folks. The Israelites were oppressed by the Hebrews. They were likely not getting paid for all of their hard labor. And here, Moses' mother not only gets her child back, but she gets paid to nurse him. Oh, the mercy of our God. But wait, there's more. One commentator pointed out that when Pharaoh's daughter gave the approval of Moses' mother to nurse the child, it ensured powerful royal protection to prevent him from being killed. Because now Moses was to be the potential adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, he now has immunity. Oh, the subtle sovereignty of God on behalf of his people. Verse 10. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him up out of the water." Now, a couple things to note here. The first is what a difficult moment for Moses' mother. That the Lord had blessed her for a time, for her to have that time with her son and to nurse him and to get paid to do so, but that she knows that one day she would have to give this boy back to Pharaoh's daughter. But I want you to notice that Moses' mother never flees with him. Even though she is probably highly aware that this day would one day come, why doesn't she flee with him to try to hold on to her son? Well, I've actually seen stuff like this before when I visited Haiti. You know, there are Haitian mothers who come to an eventual difficult realization is that they know they can't afford to care for their children, to provide enough food, to give them an education, to give them a healthy life. But they know that some of the local orphanages can. And so to ensure that their sons and daughters would have a better future, they give up their rights so that others can care for them. And that is likely what's happening here with Moses' mother. And what a heartbreaking moment for her. But I want you to see that such a sacrifice she makes is what God uses to bring his people out of Egypt. And the second thing I want to note, does anyone else notice how terribly backfiring this plan of Pharaoh's is? Anybody else noticing this? One commentator said this. They said Pharaoh's plan of genocide included the preservation of daughters. But as things turns out, it was the daughters who were his downfall. Write that in your notes. The daughters were his downfall. Because you have to understand, Pharaoh misjudged what strength was. Because Pharaoh underestimated the strength of these women in ways that he couldn't perceive. What was Pharaoh only concerned about? He was concerned about these men to grow up to be men who would fight in an army, who could overtake him, and maybe one of the men to stand up to take his throne. And yet, look at how God is using a different kind of strength in all of these women. Their confidence, their compassion, their sacrifice, their wisdom, including Pharaoh's own daughter. And all of this in order to begin the moment of events and preservation of one child of whom God would use to rescue his people out of the hand of slavery in Egypt. It reminds me of what the Apostle Paul says to the church in Corinth when he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 through 29. He says, "But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even the things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God." And women in those days, they weren't seen as strong. They were seen as weak and less than. And yet, in the subtle sovereignty of our God, he uses all of these women towards the purposes of his people. You go, girls. Verses 11 through 12. One day, when Moses had grown up and went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people, he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So obviously the author has fast-forwarded here a couple years. And he gets us to a moment when Moses is grown. And what's clear about Moses is at this point, he has somehow discovered that he is not an Egyptian. And in fact, he's a Hebrew man. You know, like Buddy the Elf talking to Leon the Snowman. When Buddy says, apparently I'm not an elf, and Leon says, of course you're not. You're 6'3" and you've had a beard since you were 15, right? He's coming to this realization. Maybe it was obvious to Moses at some point along the way, or maybe Pharaoh's daughter told him, we don't know. But either way, he had become aware that he was not an Egyptian, and that actually does something really interesting in him. He rejects his status as an Egyptian. He's in this place with all this wealth and power and security and safety. And then he comes to this understanding that he is a Hebrew man, and then because of that, he sides with his people that he hasn't spent almost any of his life with. He looks at them and says he was burdened for them. And he wanted to help his people. And because of that, he sees this as a moment to try to stand up for some kind of justice, and he kills an Egyptian. And when he does that, he threw away all the advantages that he had. You see, Moses, his heart is filled with both a sense of compassion for his people, but also a sense of justice. You know, he knows who his people are. You know, this must have been a life-changing realization of his own identity, and his actions go to show that. The only problem is he has like the right heart with all the wrong actions. You know, part of the problem here is that like Moses isn't trying to start a revolution. You know, he's just trying to deal with justice in a moment. He takes matters into his own hands. He has no formal plan of how he's actually going to like get these people out of liberation. In fact, we have no sign to say that he's even had a conversation with God yet about what's going on here. And yet there's something in him that says this is wrong and I have to side with my people. Let's see what happens in 13 through 15. It says, when he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. He said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? He answered, who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill us as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. What a tough moment for Moses. He tries to be an avenger with the Egyptian, and he tries to be a mediator for his people, and he's rejected by both. And then out of fear, he flees from Pharaoh because he knows Pharaoh well enough to know he's going to kill him. You see, Moses had the right heart, but that would not be the way that God would use him to rescue his people out of the hand of slavery. And you know that Moses could have been killed while he was still in Egypt. Pharaoh's army to go after him. But in another act of God's sovereign mercy, Moses is protected by God, not only to get out of Egypt, but he protects him on the 330 as the crow flies, journey to get to Midian. And by the way, that's mostly desert. And so it doesn't surprise us that Moses would find himself sitting down by a well. He's probably thirsty. And yet, look at what happens. Verses 16 and 17. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flocks. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered the flock. Now, it's not abnormal to see these women at the well. It was often known that the women would often get up in the morning and go get the water from the wells to go water the flock. But there seems to be this very odd, turf war happening here with these likely male shepherds who didn't want them taking water from this well. Now, regardless of what's happening here, we see Moses' character spring into action yet again. And he begins to push back against, what's happening here with this perceived injustice against these women, and he rescues them. And let me just point it out. What timing, yet again. God preserves Moses in the desert. He gets him to this well, and he stands up for these women, and he rescues them. And what does this lead to? Look at this, verses 18 through 22. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you've come home soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and he even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah, and she gave birth to a son, and he called him his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." God, in his great sovereignty and mercy, that although Moses is a fleeing murderer, subtly times it just right for Moses to sit down at this well so that he can run into these women and help them. And in helping them, opens up this door for this man, this Midian priest, to be so grateful in his heart for what Moses did, to give to him one of his daughters. That Moses is on the run. And God still preserves him through this community, through this new family. And you can tell, though, that Moses still feels lost. And we learn that from how he named his son, Gershom, which means I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. That even the women still thought that he was an Egyptian. Maybe in what he was wearing, or maybe he told them that. Regardless, he still seems slightly ashamed of his Hebrew heritage because they have rejected him. He is lost, yes, but God has not forgotten him, nor has God forgotten his people. Look at verses 23 through 25. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. The cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Now, as we read chapter 2, and we get to verses 23 through 25, you may go, "Oh, look, God finally shows up in the narrative." Not so fast. God has been active the whole time. He is the subtly sovereign God. The God whom weaves the smallest amounts of history for his ends, for his people. Remember, he uses the first sight of Pharaoh's daughter's eyes to see the basket, her compassionate heart, the close proximity and suggestion of Miriam, the protection of Moses by Pharaoh's daughter, the sacrifice of Jochebed for her son for his upbringing. Moses' fear, his emotions of fear to drive him out of Egypt. And the timing at the well with the daughter of the Midian priest, and the preservation of Moses in the wilderness with his family. Our God uses all of these things to bring about the eventual liberation of his people. You see, my brothers and sisters, God seems as though he may work way more in the subtle moments of life than he does in the Red Sea splitting moments. We're always looking for the Red Sea splitting moments, and when we do that, we miss the subtle ways that God is weaving our lives together. We missed it this morning. We may miss it after this, of how he's using us as a people, as individuals towards his ends and his purposes. And you may be asking, what does this have to do with me? But remember, I told you to start asking 2 questions when you start coming in here. What does this have to do with us? I will tell you. I want you to take our people, for example. Listen to me. Every person in this room is meant to be used by God. You are not here by accident. And even the people that for whatever reason have left our church, God has sent them on to do good things for his kingdom. My brothers and sisters, don't miss the subtle ways that God is trying to use us and shape us for meetings to happen and friendships to form and relationships to be built. He is using all of these things. My brothers and sisters, God has built in us and he is building us, not in a revival or a fireworks display, not in a massive Red Sea splitting moment, but subtly and surely. And it's easy for us, yes, to look back and see those things now, but let us try to notice those subtle things every day. Can we take note of those moments? That he is weaving all things for the purposes of his people. And not just for the people of Israel, but for all of his people. And for the Israelites to get out of slavery, it began with a baby boy, born to lowly parents, who was given up in order to be used by God to rescue his people out of bondage to slavery. But for all of us, what did it begin with? Another baby boy, born to lowly parents, not placed in a basket, but in a manger of hay, not who grew up in a palace, but in ordinary Nazareth, not as a child sent down like lightning from the heavens, but as one who fell to the earth as silent as winter snow, who grew up in a relatively normal way, a carpenter's son, who would one day rise up after a lifetime of ordinary to begin to teach people about the love and living for God, whose mother would one day watch him go into the hands of another, not to hold him and care for him, but to whip him and crucify him, who declared from the cross, "It is finished." Why? So that you and I could be brought out of our bondage to sin, so that we could be free. And that massive moment for us was preceded by all the subtle moments that God weaved our Lord Jesus Christ through this life. Our God is continuing to shape us as a people, and we need to look for it each and every day, to have an eye to see the subtle moments of God's sovereignty in our lives and in the hands of this church, because he has built us and he is building us.